Hi,
Howdy, how are you guys?
good.
Okay, we have enough material that I don't know if we can take a break. I mean, I'm sorry, we can finish early, but we may need to take a break. That's what I'm trying to say. But we're still definitely in early. And if things are going, rapidly enough, we could just keep going through and not have a break and then maybe, a few minutes earlier than that. Okay, so we just have to see how it goes. But we have a few things to cover before we get to tonight's lecture. So the first thing I was going to mention is that I returned. Let me just take a look. I have a list here. I try to keep it updated as of today, as of 5 o'clock today. I returned, it looks like 14, no, more than that, 15. Yeah, okay, so it's a good number. 15, 16, 14, 15, 16, 18 papers from this class, but the enrollment numbers say 27. I know that's probably high. Every semester there's a handful, maybe even half a dozen students in any class, on average, that just don't bother to drop and then turned up, on the roll sheet, and I have to give them Fs. That's their problem. I think they've known long enough. If they wanted to drop, the drop deadline is already passed. But that still leaves me short a few papers, is my point. So in fact, let me go ahead and do this full screen here thing. Meaning that if you're one of those dwindling number, maybe no one here tonight is, but for those who are listening to this on YouTube after 8 p.m. on Fridays, you'll be able to see this if you miss part of it. Or review, of course, because there will be at least one architecture slide from either last week or this week, and maybe two on the final, possibly one in the slide analysis and one in the slide essay part, short essays, and then one identification, probably one of in each. So it's important to make sure you know the material from last week and this week. In any case, if there's still anybody out there who hasn't turned their papers in this class, I really urge you to do it between now and before the next class, because then you should be pivoting towards reviewing, of course, for the final. And we're going to review, that's going to be the main task next week. For how the final is going to be given. I can summarize briefly, same format
on my computer. So
same
weird.
format, same number of slides as the midterm, not cumulative. I know I've said it like 5 times. But some people still aren't sure. You don't have to go back for the midterm.
Not.
So we have a family scenario there. That's fine. I understand how that is. Okay. Anyway, so what I'm trying to get everyone to realize is if we have one more week before final exams. They used to call it dead week, but nobody does that anymore. Well, my daughter's school does. The Albany High School does. Yeah. Anyway, the point is that most colleges that I used to go, of the ones I went to, 3 different colleges plus taught for years at, until recently here at the JC, had a week off. But we need to do the review because we probably won't finish all the must-know slides of architecture tonight. In fact, the odds are we'll finish most of them except the 2 we didn't get to last week from before 1900, the Eiffel Tower, right? And then the other one, I'll have to pull it out. Oh, the Crystal Palace, yes, which is not a minor, it's a first modern building, period. Okay, let me let this next person in. Okay, hello, is that, we're just starting, just doing some announcing about late papers really need to be, hi, how you doing? If you still have one and extra credit. Now I'm going to give you an extension on extra credit because I realize everyone's focused on classwork, lectures, notes, your life, and then reviewing for the finals, not only mine. So I will give you an extension until the day that the final exam is due. And that's a really important announcement. I just made this decision, so I haven't had time to send out an email. I probably will tomorrow to all my students in the classes this semester that I'm teaching, which is that they just moved up the due date for all the grades to be submitted by all instructors at the JC to June 4th. They used to make it the 7th or 8th, 6th at the earliest. So that means we have less than 4 days after Memorial Day weekend. I hope we have lives. I'm going to do something with my family on that weekend. So I can't wait until Sunday night, which would be the 30th, of May, to get all the exams and then start logging them in, sending them to my readers, grading the ones I grade, checking their grading, and calculating the grades. Now you get it, plus entering your extra credit. So the cutoff is going to be pretty hard and firm. I'm going to have to make it 5 p.m. on Saturday, I think is reasonable. In case you work and you need the time to go back and check your answers, I promise everyone that on both the midterm and the final. I've been doing that for the whole time we're doing remote teaching. So you will have the option of going back, or if you miss the night of the test, it'll be posted for, I said, at least 48 hours. Yeah, close to it. It might be 46. In other words, from Thursday, late afternoon, I'll probably be able to put it up by 5. You'll have until 5 p.m. on Saturday. I used to make it like noon on Sunday. That's not going to work this semester. That I would lose a whole, 24 hours or so of grading time, advanced time. I need that for you guys to get your grades on time. And so you have your transcripts and everything else that you need, from the end of this semester, from this class. Okay, so, but that still gives you, after the test itself has been given in real time, I will post both exams. To be fair, I don't want to post one longer. That would be this class, an extra day. It wouldn't be fair to the one I teach on Wednesday, right? I have to give equal opportunity to everybody. That's only fair way to do it. So I'll post them both Thursday, and then they'll both be taken down. There's no extensions possible. So if you hadn't seen the test, or you didn't finish it, or you want to just go back and double check your answers, you'll have that 2-day window. I'll remind you more than once before then. You'll get an email later this week, either tomorrow or Thursday, and then again, final exams weekend, one more before the deadline. So, and with extra credit, the same cutoff. I'll say 5 p.m. on Saturday, May 30th. That's plenty of time, and nobody's taken full advantage. I think someone's one of the students here is up to 25, or a couple of you 30 points, but no one's done 50. And if you don't need to, fine, but it might help. Even if you're earning an A, you never know if something happens with the final or whatever. It gives you a nice cushion for getting the maximum grade. Of course, hopefully an A is what everyone wants. All right, before I proceed to something one of your fellow students, I forget, was it William or somebody last week, pointed out I didn't cover, pretty important, one of the 2 last new terms. We covered one of them, for 4 main features of First Bay tradition architecture, in last week's lecture, and that'll be on the, of course, YouTube posting. But we didn't even get to or discuss, the 5 main movements of early modern architecture. So I decided that, in a way, that just as well, because I've written them down neatly, and I think you'll agree my hand-printed notes are not too hard to read. So you guys can take a screenshot, or just, you'll see this when if you review this lecture on YouTube for, studying for your finals. So I'm going to hold it up the screen in a minute. But I think before that, I'm going to read you something I think is really appropriate and witty. Well, let's just say relevant. Here we go. It was in the San Francisco Chronicle. Yes, I still read. I've written, some of you know, right? Of course, I've written actual print in both the print and online edition of the Santa Rosa Press Democrat. It's now 5 op-eds in the last year. But this isn't anything I wrote. It's not about any kind of, extra credit. It's a letter to the editor. I bet most of you have heard of the honey bears. You know what I'm talking about, anybody? That some guy's been doing for about 2 years now, since before the pandemic, but they proliferated during the pandemic. There's, I assume, stenciled on different walls, commercial and residential structures all over the Bay Area. My daughter was excited to see one on the side of a house in El Cerrito as we were driving on our daddy-daughter day drive. We do every Saturday, so we can listen to music that her mom wouldn't like her to listen to, if you follow my meaning. Her choice of music, and while we just take a drive and talk and listen to tunes. And she spotted it was on the wall of a house in El Cerrito. So now I know what they look like in person. There was a whole long, the reason this is even relevant, a long article about people objecting to this whole mode of art. And yet some of these same people were doing it themselves with other imagery. The fact that it is a honey bear, everyone knows what a honey bear looks like, right? It's in the store. It has been since I was a little kid. Exact same shape and design of the bottle with a squeeze top and the the snout on top of the bear's head, right? Yeah, it's a common image. And yes, it's mass produced. in our culture as a item for sale, and it is now on the walls of dozens of buildings. But the guy was defending himself against critics, saying that this is some kind of art gentrification and it's not appropriate and it's using up the wall space other people could use to tag or do their own thing or something else. So I just thought it was a little more than a bit excessive, all the complaints. But anyway, the Chronicle reporters covered both sides, the pro and cons. They interviewed the artist, some of his fellow artists, some of whom thought he was doing good work, because half his proceeds from anything he actually sells, which he does sell some of these images as, works of art separately, and he has a website. Well, shoot the man. He's, making money off of his art. That's evil, right? I don't agree. Anyway, I understand why some people might criticize it, but there is, another side to it. So here's that side. It's just 2 paragraphs, short paragraphs. And it was a letter to the editor, No Sense to Defacing Art. And I thought that's an odd title for a letter to the editor. The recent defacing of Finches, that's the artist's name. He doesn't give his real name, of course, just like Banksy. Everyone knows about Banksy, right? Because his stuff's okay, though, right? Because it's more political. Anyway, but Black Lives Matter has gotten some funding from this guy's work. He's donated several of the proceeds from several of his projects to them, as well as to other things like COVID equity programs to get more people shots when they couldn't get to the mass vaccination shots. So he's done some good too. Okay, here's this point, and then we'll start with tonight's topic. The recent defacing of Finch's Honey Bears murals reminded me of the following quote from Whoopi Goldberg. I love this. I've always liked Whoopi Goldberg. I actually met her when I was a realtor once. Art and life are subjective. Not everybody's going to dig what I dig, but I reserve the right to dig it. Likewise, everyone's got the right not to dig it, but no one has the right to deface other people's art. For crying out loud, we're talking about bear-shaped bottles of honey, not statues of Confederate generals or monuments to early explorers who exploited the native peoples of America. Now, of course, that's a different whole subject, right? Where will this stop? Does someone have the right to walk through the Louvre Museum in Paris with a can of spray paint and deface all the Renaissance paintings because they were financed by wealthy Italian noblemen? Good point. Yeah. Sometimes history needs to be at least accessible and given context, critiqued, whatever, even objected to, but not always destroyed, defaced, or removed. So I think it's an important topic. All right, let's get to tonight's subject, which is very important for all of you, because one of these slides tonight will be on the final and one from last week, probably. I'm going to hold this up. Let's see, I always have to do it this way so you can see the whole thing. These are the 5 movements of early modern architecture. And since I'm holding this up, I'll just restate them briefly, and you guys can do however you want. Either write them down on your handouts with the terms to know where I left enough space, or just use this for whatever, make a screenshot, whatever works for you. Okay, the first, we've already covered the first 2, actually the first 3. The Chicago School. That's another phrase or term for early skyscrapers. And Louis Sullivan was the first slide we saw last weekend. His work is highly likely that slide of his early Chicago School. That means invented in Chicago. Skyscrapers were invented in Chicago, not New York. That's why it's called the Chicago School. Louis Sullivan is an artist you want to make sure you study. Won't be cutting that slide of his skyscraper from last week. And the same thing with Prairie School, another way of saying early houses. It's actually a phrase coined by Mr. F.L. Frank Lloyd Wright and his followers. Okay, the third one we covered is Bay Area-based movement. First, Bay tradition, another way of saying organic design, or some people today would say green design, and it really is a kind of green design. And that would be Morgan and Maybeck, okay? And then the last one we are going to get to, last 2, I mean tonight for sure, Bauhaus or International. The 2 terms are interchangeable, they're synonymous. That would be artists that we're going to see tonight, the first 2 slides, in fact, Gropius and then Mies van der Rohe. If you can't tell, those are German names, and they changed the face of the skylines of every major city in the world, just in one school of architecture of design in Germany. and that was even before World War II. And since World War II, their style has overtaken almost every other style for high rises or skyscrapers around the world. So that's why we say international. And lastly, glass houses, pretty well self-explanatory. Philip Johnson, the American named Philip Johnson, is the most famous practitioner, but there were others who were doing glass houses. And even Maybach did one in Berkeley, where I had a major event, a book signing launch party, they call it, whatever my publisher arranged, in a house he designed in 1914 with glass walls all around it. And that's 35 years before the first glass house that Philip Johnson designed. So they actually go back to the very early 1900s. We'll see a couple of those tonight. Okay, so let's get started with our first. But first, any questions anybody has before we proceed with any of the things I touched on? Extra credit, of course, a bunch of grades. Okay. And of course, anybody, anytime can send me an email asking for their point total and how many more points, what grade they're earned up to that point. And then you'll know how much more you need to get an A. Okay, let's hope this is going to, this should work. Yeah. All right, I mean, not be hard to see. So let's get this hide thumbnail and let's get this enlarged. Okay, and move this. Can everybody see this? It's our first must know for tonight. Okay. Well, this is going to be one that's going to elicit a definition because, of course, it's got the name of the school and one of the 5 movements of architecture I just gave you that you should have either in your notes or a screenshot of, the Bauhaus School. Okay, so the name of this slide, okay, the title of this one, is at the top of tonight's list. Gropius is the architect. Gropius. The title is Bauhaus Shop Block. That's 2 words. Shop block, like it sounds, is 1 word. Bauhaus, well, you see it right there, but I'll go ahead and spell it Bauhaus. And the date is 1926. Bauhaus is a term that has more than one meaning, but for this slide, you only need to know the 2 most important ones in architecture. Bauhaus literally is German for to build a house. So that was the name of the school of design in Germany where this style was created. The style this building is a Bauhaus, or you could say / international style, because people call them either or both, almost interchangeably, those 2 terms. Again, Bauhaus, the German word for both to build a house and for the name of this style of architecture. Really, it's got a triple meaning because it's also an actual school in this case. The other schools of design are not physical schools. This one was. It's where the style was invented. That's an important fact. That's what you're looking at. You're looking at, well, the building's been bombed during World War II. It's gone now. But the way it looked, pretty nice quality photograph, must have been taken during the 30s. Or so, because it's as sharp as can be, and it's how this building looked for the 20 plus years it was standing. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the first building in the Bauhaus style. So let me give you that description of what that means. It is obviously a major part of the meaning of this and any other architecture slide. This was the building in which the architecture program was taught at the school known as Bauhaus. They also, at that same school, they taught other forms of visual arts, such as drawing, photography, painting, sculpture, and so forth. But their most famous school of design was the architecture program, which was housed right here in this building. And the style of the building, for this is the first example of Bauhaus, was so radical, so innovative or different than anything that had come before, that it immediately caused, you could say, controversy, but a sensation is good enough. It caused a major impact in the world of architecture, and it became very influential, but mostly in Europe before World War II. It didn't have much impact over here in the United States. That happens after the war, and we'll talk about that as we go through some of the other slides tonight. But for now, let's say, what does it mean to say something as Bauhaus style? Like what style, how do you know what this building, why is this building an example of it? Because what those are form follows function. Remember, I used that phrase with Louis Sullivan, so it applies to this style more than it does any other. It's when the building's appearance reflects its structure and its purpose with no ornament. None. You see that there's no, I mean, unless you count the lettering, which kind of is very, 1920s lettering here. Other than that, there is no effort at any stylizing of any kind on the outside or inside of this. But so I'll say that again, the Bauhaus school believed in form follows function, which is a philosophy that a building should always look like its purpose and reflect the construction or structure of the. So you see the actual framing is the point here. Let's get up closer. That's the actual framing of the outer walls on this one side anyway. And of course the overall, window, frames themselves. But this is the actual structural elements you're seeing here, the flooring, right, at the corners. And then the parts that are covered by concrete at this one end still have a functional look. I mean, there's no ornament, in other words, no decoration, none. So Sullivan would have hated this style. Well, actually, I think he lived long enough. Yeah, I think he died right about when it started. Louis Sullivan, I mentioned last week, believed that all good buildings should have something to delight the eye of the beholder. Just the opposite of this philosophy. This group of architects, the Bauhaus School, that would be the group of architects that taught and trained there and then spread their style around the world after World War II. Those architects believed in something totally different. And here's what one of the main architects at that school said is their philosophy of design. It's very simple. It's a very short phrase. Less is more. Less is more. You might have heard that as a cliche. And a lot of marketers and advertisers and website designers and even authors and like not politicians, they don't believe in that, but anyway, less is more is a philosophy underlying this, which means the building has its own form of beauty supposedly by just showing off the structural elements with no ornament. Everything's functional. So again, you go all the way back to the earlier phrase that came from the mid 1800s in Europe. Even before all these five modern movements of architecture, there was the phrase form follows function, and it was applied to not only architecture, but to some early modern sculpture and painting. But here it's very clear. You're seeing the actual materials used to construct the building. They're exposed to the eye from the exterior, and if you were to walk in through the building on the inside, the same thing. You'd see the framework of the building and, no ornament, in other words, anywhere. Everything is functional. Okay, so another way of saying it is glass and steel boxes. That's not inaccurate. If you want to use that phrase, and it's easier to remember, I'm not saying this will be on the final, but were it to be on the essay part, I would say that'd be accurate enough. You could say it that way. They look like glass and steel boxes. It's a 4-story tall, looks like a shoebox to me, right? There is no variety of decoration of any kind, and there's no variety of color, unless you count the one little bit of color here, the pink door. Okay, that's it. Everything else has little to, I mean, okay, the color of the concrete is painted, the exterior of the concrete, the surface, I should say, is painted gray, but that's hardly any kind of bright, warm, or earth tone, obviously. So they didn't use warm earth tones or warm tones of any kind in these buildings, with tiny little exception there. All right, that's pretty much the whole meaning, except to say who was Gropius, the architect. He was one of the leading founders of the Bauhaus, the school, about the actual design school, and he invented this style. So he's a pretty important person in the history of modern architecture. Because what happens after World War II, as some of you already can visualize, just thinking, what is the skyline of most American cities? At least the buildings built after 1945 or 50, the more, I know it doesn't seem recent to some of you, but right, the more, relatively recent ones built after World War II, in other words, they're all glass and steel boxes, aren't they? With slight variations. I mean, even Frank Gehry, basically his buildings are variations on glass and steel boxes, but of course they're not rectangular, so there's more variety there, but they are also inspired by this movement. So the whole idea of the modern glass and steel skyscraper starts here in this school. And the last fact, it might be maybe the most interesting for some people, is Hitler hated this style. And he closed the school, not right away, because it was so famous he couldn't when he became dictator, right? But before World War II, I think it was on about 20 years after it was open, before the war started, he closed the school. And it's just as well, because all those architects could see the writing on the wall and they left. Had they not, they'd have been sent into concentration camps. Yeah, he actually had artists murdered. You probably knew that, right? Hitler, if he didn't like an artist, he would have them rounded up, arrested, and if they were very lucky, they might just be, tortured and then exiled. But if they weren't, they went to a concentration camp. Yeah, he had his long list of people he wanted to take, revenge on, because he was rejected. You know this. You have to write this. When he applied for art school in Vienna, he was rejected, and he never forgave the fact that happened once. So he hated all. The only kind of art he liked was the traditional neoclassic style that had been around for centuries, of course. Okay, so he hated this school, and he had it closed. You could add that as one last fact about the meaning. Sometime in the late 1930s. And so it had only been open for like 20 years. And then it was destroyed by bombing in World War II. So it's not open anymore. Okay, let's do the formal analysis. This building is balanced, although you could make the case, because of this block of concrete on the far right end of it, that it seems unbalanced. But the shape of it, overall, it's all rectangular. And, this is slightly, to be absolutely accurate, maybe an 18-inch differential in the height of the concrete wing at the far end where the entrance is. But that's pretty minor, plus which it has another concrete block or wing at the opposite end, which you can't see in this photo. So it's balanced, symmetrical, left to right and top to bottom. It's full of rhythm, of course, with the repeated shapes of the framing on the windows. And of course, the metal grating, right, itself. And then these two strips of white painted concrete give it some kind of visual rhythm as well. And then the lettering, you could even say, is kind of rhythm, of course, even though the letters are, well, the A repeats, obviously, and the U. So, but it has a sort of a rhythm. Now, is it stable or, well, it is so stable. There's very few examples of Bauhaus skyscrapers have anything dynamic, except the more recent ones. The ones done in the last 10 or 15 years, and that's partly due to Frank Gehry, but not only, because there were architects already making round glass and steel buildings in the 60s, or late 60s anyway. And certainly by the 80s, it became fairly common. So, but this is not at all dynamic, nothing about it. No, unless you want to count the lettering, but it's not part of the building. So of course it's stable. All the lines are straight and right angles at every corner. All right, and then the largest mass, well, it's the central section, if you want to say the main wing or section, the central area, because there are two, as I said, one you can't see here. If you walked around the corner, you'd see it just past the edge of the building, exactly the same shape as this. So there's really only three masses, and the largest is the central section or main section, and then the two wings are equal. So there's only two sizes here, two sizes of masses. The base here is a 4-story building with about 14-foot high ceilings. So the total height of the building is a little over 40 feet. That's the real space. In the interior, you don't have to write about that, but it's divided into different size classrooms and different size workrooms for the students to create their projects, right? So just different varieties of sizings of rooms inside. All right, and then we have the colors pretty much close to neutral. This makes it look like this is blue, but it's not. These are black. So the picture's got a little bit of a discolored effect. I've seen enough photos of this, but how documentaries have been. There were film crews coming here in the 30s to film this building. It was that influential, from not just from Germany or Europe, even from America and China. It was pretty influential, the whole design philosophy, the school itself, and this one building, since it started a whole trend, right? So I can tell you that's black in actual real terms. Black paint over metal, of course, framing. So what we have is neutral colors, pretty much. Gray, right? White on the concrete and the lettering, and then obviously translucent on the glass. and black, which is obviously neutral on all the framing. And then we have the textures are all real, of course. We've got real smooth concrete, real smooth glass, and real smooth metal framing. And the lines here are visual. There's no carved lines, of course, formed by the framing here. And the modeling is if the shadows from the sun at the edges. Okay, let's go to the next one. Now I've seen Bauhaus. You can't go see. There's rubble where it used to be. It was near the Berlin Wall, but you don't have to write this. And when I got to Berlin before the Berlin Wall was completely down, it had just started coming down. It was a pretty exciting time to be there. And people were beginning to walk without being afraid of being shot in the back by soldiers from their own government, you know, the East German communist dictatorship. They were finally able safely to go back and forth between two halves of their own city. There was a sign where the Bauhaus had been, and mentioning it was bombed during World War II. Of course, almost all Berlin was into near rubble, but there's still a few pieces of one or two buildings, like the foundations, left. So it's a historic landmark of kinds of a sort. Okay, this one, the next must know, is Le Corbusier. Now, I don't speak French. Ich spreche ein wenig Deutsch, so I do know how to pronounce Bauhaus and the meaning of some German words, but I don't speak French, so I am going to tell you that this is his nickname, and he adopted it, so it became the name he signed his drawings with. He was a French architect. Okay, there's two words. His last name, Le, or well, it's really just his pen name. It's not really his real name. First word Le, you know, as in Spanish, it's La, means, and then Corbusier, Corbusier. Again, capital Corbusier, Le Corbusier, some would say, I guess, is closer to the correct pronunciation. The title of this is Villa, two words, Savoy. Villa, of course, has two L's, right? Villa, and then Savoy is capital Savoye, 1930. This some people consider to be a Bauhaus building on stilts, or a Bauhaus house. I know that sounds redundant, but think about it. It's, you know, if you're saying it in English, that's not an inappropriate way to say it. A house in the Bauhaus, you know, vein or similar to Bauhaus style, but it's a single family residence. So a Bauhaus house on stilts is one nickname it's been given. Others call it one of the first modern houses, but there's a problem with that. I don't think that's accurate, and most historians now would agree that that's overstating it. It might be the first modern house in France. So just say many historians consider this to be the first modern house in France. It's out in the middle of France, kind of out of nowhere, rural France, surrounded by green fields all around. I've been to it. It wasn't open. It's a private residence, still is. But, you know, I just had to go see it because I knew where it was, and I was already teaching here, and my French friends in their car drove us out there just to take a look at it. It's not near Paris. It's a ways outside. So just say it's in a rural part of France where the land around it makes it feasible to have a house designed like this, because what you have is a wall of windows, which is similar to the Bauhaus, of course, which we just saw with the shop block. But the concrete here is even a more prominent part or prevalent part of the exterior. And then this house borrows from Frank Lloyd Wright. Le Corbusier had another nickname, at least some people in France acknowledged the debt he owed to Frank Lloyd Wright, and they often called him the Frank Lloyd Wright of France. And that's not a bad way to describe him, except for one thing. Wright believed in some color, some variety of material and texture, and at least some sense of warmth in his buildings, at least most of them. There's none of that here. This, of course, is all the neutral, we'll do the form analysis, of course, at the end, colors that we would expect. And just the, again, form follows function is really another way of saying that's what you're seeing here, only this way. In this example, it's done with the residential purpose or function of a single family residence, rendered as a, and here's a quote, actually it should be in your notes. I'm not saying this will be on the final, but if it is, part of the meaning would be, the architect himself described this house, which he thought was a masterpiece. He called it a machine for living, quote unquote, literally a machine for living. Well, I don't know about other people, but I don't fancy the idea of living in a machine. It just doesn't appeal to me. And this house was so extremely ahead of its time, you could say it that way, or radically different is a better way to say it, than any of the other architectural styles for homes in France at that time. Again, it caused a sensation. It got international attention and it made him famous. And then he went on to build more houses like this. But guess what? Only well-to-do, like upper middle class or wealthy people could afford them. I don't think it's his fees that was the problem. It was that you had to have a lot of land around because you would have no privacy or very little privacy if you lived in a house where every wall has a wall of windows at above waist level, or down, up to or down below. I meant down to waist level. In other words, anything you do from the waist up, you could be seen from all around on all four sides. So it has very little privacy. Of course, if you have a mini forest of trees, lots of grass, land, meadow, whatever, yard, huge lot around the house, then it works. Of course, it makes sense. But it really doesn't work very well in an urban setting. Yet these were built in some big cities, some of these homes in the suburbs, mostly of Paris and Marseille and other big French cities. So it caught on with some home builders, mostly upper middle class and in mostly rural areas. But there were some, probably several hundred at least, built in the suburbs of Paris. And this is in the 1930s, so it was pretty advanced. What did he owe to Frank Lloyd Wright? The utility core. That's what this is. And if I had another view, which I didn't find another one that was as well focused as this. So I just thought we'd just look at this view. If it's on the test, this is this angle you'll see. But if you were to walk around here or see a photo of it from here, you'd see that that looks very much like a rounded version of the utility core in the Roby house, which, by the way, again, I said this last week, but if you weren't here, that slide is really high on the probability list of ones that'll be on the final. The Frank Lloyd Wright's first prairie house, or first fully prairie house. That's really the first modern house. So that's why most historians don't agree anymore that this qualifies. But it's probably the first modern house, at least the first famous modern house in France. But the man was clearly inspired by some of Frank Lloyd Wright's early Usonian work, because the other place it should vaguely resemble, let's go ahead here, is this one. You see, falling water we covered last week. There's no question that the projecting slabs of concrete, but look at how much more color there is and variety of texture and material. On this one, you've just got barren walls. Of course, it's the Bauhaus influence clearly is inspiring this design and this architect. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of Francois Truffaut, the French movie director. He hated this style of architecture. He, first of all, was a kind of a cameo role in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, one of Spielberg's early successes, right? God, that movie's 40 years old now. Anyway, he's in that movie as a minor character. But more important than that is he made a movie of Ray Bradbury's novel, Fahrenheit 451. That movie won every international award, including Best Foreign Film, I think, that year. This is a French film, of course. And he uses Le Corbusier's buildings, like this house and a bunch of other high-rise, he called them rat's nests. They were like 30-story concrete blockhouse architecture where no one had a balcony or any greenery or any color or any relief from this machines for living lifestyle. The architect wanted everyone to live in the same kind of space. Exactly. Frankly, I just detest that kind of architecture, but that's a matter of opinion. So you're going to just say it was controversial. And Truffaut is 40 years later, he made that movie. And he used the houses all over southern France where he filmed it to be the future, horribly mind-controlled society. If you don't know Ray Bradbury's work and you're not in science fiction, just forget it. But if you are and you haven't read science fiction now, of course, is very different, but he's one of the greats, of course. And Fahrenheit 451 is a classic, both the book and the movie. And these kind of houses, these machines for living, are used in every scene in that movie, including the main characters that have this horribly dead, dull, lifeless marriage and life because their minds are being, controlled by their masters of the society. Anyway, the point is that this kind of forces everyone into a machine-like state of being, is the point that that movie was making, and many other critics, not just that film. I would agree with it. It just doesn't appeal to most people, but maybe it does to some. And if it does, and you've got the land, well, then it could be a pleasant environment for those who would like that kind of architecture. Okay, let's do the formal analysis. There's no question, there's no color here at all. I mean, you could say white paint, yes, of course, but that's neutral. Obviously, with black, you can see here, you get a closer black paint over the window, metal window framing. And then we have the largest mass is the main floor. The ground floor is the utilities space, the laundry room, workshop, and a garage. You would imagine all the functional spaces. And there it isn't 3 stories, it's only 2. That's the utility shaft here that we talked about. Central utility core is the right phrase. That he definitely borrowed that idea from Frank Lloyd Wright's Roby house. And then we have the rhythm. Oh yeah, the stilts that it's raised on, and this band. They often call these ribbon, as in the word ribbon with, of course, 2 B's, ribbon windows. But a better phrase is banded, to be banded together. That's what most architects call this kind of arrangement of windows. So that creates rhythm. And of course, the shape of the building, right? It's the same exact shape, same length, same rectangular outlines on all 4 sides. And then the modeling is just whenever the sun hits it, whatever the natural shadows are. The lines here are visual around the windows. And it's completely stable except for the utility core. That's rounded. Now for light, you do have the central, I should have mentioned this probably, the only saving grace I think of, many critics would agree, to this house, or this style of house, at least this version, is there is a central light court, or, open area. I think you can see that here from here, somebody taking a photo. Let's get up close. Yeah, it's a tourist. I guess they did. It's privately owned, so they must have to open it to public viewing, just like a lot of famous houses, so many days a year. Anyway, I didn't get to go inside it, but I did get to see pretty clearly from a slight distance. I could look in and see it's a nice open light court. So there is natural light that is part of the modeling that floods at certain times of the day into the various rooms around the outer edge, is where all the living spaces are. So it does have that sort of its own inner courtyard or patio. And that is a nice feature. The materials, the textures, all real smooth concrete, real smooth glass, and real smooth metal, of course. And I think I said the lines are visual right at the corners. Well, here where the sun's not hitting it, it's barely visible, but you can sort of see there is an edge. And of course, the windows form the most prominent visual line, no drawn or painted lines. And it's balanced roughly. Now, the utility core kind of weighs it to the left, but the structure, the main part, the living area, both levels, the ground floor and the second story, those are symmetrical totally, as almost all Bauhaus and this version of it, if you want to call it that, residential designs by the same architect, Le Corbusier. His were almost always symmetrical, left to right and top to bottom, except for the fact that there's no solid wall space down here. So if you want to say it's weighted toward the top, I wouldn't argue with that. Okay, I think we've covered everything here. So now we need to switch to a different file. That won't take too long, or shouldn't take too long. Hang on. I have to go back out. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so we're going to go to the second. Here we go. And it's pictures. There we go. Sorry, you got to see my files here. Part 2, 20th century architecture. Here we go. We're going to see a glass and steel box first. Now, screen sharing is paused, so I'm going to resume share, and please tell me if this is working. Wait a minute. Oops, why did it do that? Stop share on this one. Oh, I remember. It does this weird thing. We have to go back twice. Okay, here we go. It's a little slow today. Okay, there. Okay, do you guys see this? It's important for me to know. I hope you guys can see this. This is the next must know.
All I'm seeing is
No.
your camera feed.
Uh-oh. It's wanting to do that again. Okay, we'll just go back to. I think what's happening is I have to go down. Oh, I know what I do. Okay, I think maybe I don't have to go back again. Hang on. Okay, yeah, I know what I have to do. I've hit the bottom. For some reason, the top icon doesn't do that. It should do it now. Let's see. Hang on. I hit screen share again and then hit it again. Not have to go all the way back out. That's what I'm trying to avoid. You guys are being patient. I appreciate it. Now, can you see it?
Yeah.
Yep, I can see
Good.
it.
Yeah, because it says it's sharing. Thank you. I appreciate your input, your feedback. All right, here we go. This is the next must know. The Glass House. Well, that I don't think I have to spell for anybody, right? The Glass House. 3 words is the title. The architect's last name, also pretty common, Johnson, right? Johnsson, 1949. Okay, so hang on. I'm going to turn my ceiling fan on. I don't know about where you guys are. It's literally at the edge of my room here. I'd forgotten. It's gotten quite hot here. I think it's hotter up there usually than it is here. Okay, there we go. So this is just say many historians consider this house to be the prototype of the first glass or glass houses. The first glass houses. There we go. I'll say it again. Many historians consider this house, this residence, to be the prototype for all of the early glass houses in the United States, you'd have to say. Philip Johnson was an American architect. He was an acquaintance. You want to say friend? They were rivals, but he knew Frank Lloyd Wright. He was influenced by, you could say, and inspired, both influenced by and inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright. But Wright never designed anything like this. He wouldn't have, because it's too cold for what Wright believed in. And we'll say why. And you don't have to agree with any of this. This is just how, obviously some critics, myself included, might view these things. But there's another whole new aspect of the meaning that I can summarize in like 90 seconds or so that didn't even 2 years ago wasn't that well known. This isn't the first glass box house. Literally, first is not the first glass box house in the United States. And that's been proven now because another Bauhaus architect, not Gropius, he and Mies van der Rohe, and you could just use his first name because everyone calls him that, all architects, historians, critics, just use his first name because he became so famous. We have one of his works in a few minutes, you'll see in one of the next few slides. But you could just write his first name as part of the controversy here. Mies, it's a German first name. Mies, it's how he called himself. He signed his work that way because he was an egomaniac, like so many architects. He thought of himself as equally important to Frank Lloyd Wright, and Wright and he were rivals. So let's summarize it this way to keep it brief. Mies, if you want to write his full name, it's Van, V-A-N, der, D-E-R, Rohe, R-O-H-E, but you can just keep it simple for now. We'll get to his full name with his work on a future slide. But Mies, you could just say, who came from the Bauhaus school to the United States before World War II. Remember I said Hitler closed that school, so he kicked everyone out, and the smart ones left Germany, and he was one who did. He went to Chicago, Mies did. And so did Gropius. My father took classes from Walter Gropius at the Art Institute of Chicago. It's pretty amazing when I think about it, that connection. Anyway, the point is the two of them went to the Midwest, to specifically Chicago, because they knew Chicago was the birthplace of Frank Lloyd Wright's early prairie houses and the first skyscrapers. And Mies designed a glass and steel box in suburban Chicago long before this, like 1941 or something like that. Maybe it was a little later, but it was definitely before this. And he didn't get the credit that Johnson got. Johnson was better at promoting himself. Just say the controversy is now resurfaced among historians. Of course, most people couldn't care less, but it mattered to the people who, at the time, who designed these buildings, and to historians, and of course, art history students. It should matter. It's hard to say who invented the glass and steel box or did the first one. This is the first famous glass and steel box in the United States. And because of that fact, no one would argue it became the most influential example of glass and steel box architecture for houses. Actually, glass box. I misspoke. It is steel, but of course, they just shortened it to glass box houses. It is the most influential glass box house. Say that fast 5 times. And because it was on the cover of a bunch of magazines. And there were, filming crews who went here to film it. The guy, it doesn't matter who, I don't even know his name, had it designed for him by Johnson, was a fairly successful sculptor. No one's heard of him now, but at the time he was, reasonably well respected. So he invited people to come, take photos of the house and write articles in magazines or even do interviews with him in the house. So you see how that would have promoted the idea of glass box houses. Whereas Mises' house was forgotten, probably because a little interruption in the middle of the 40s there called World War II, kind of distracted people. So Mises' earlier example got forgotten, and he resented Johnson for that. I think those little sidelines of human rivalries are interesting, but that's a minor footnote. What's more important is what happened with this style of house. And now I'm going to ask, I'm sure some of you already thought about this. What could be the drawbacks with this kind of house? Okay, we see that it has only one private area in the middle. And that, of course, would be where you might have all the systems. Yeah, sounds familiar, like the central utility core that we talked about. I couldn't find any other images closer up than this that were free not free, were available on the internet. But there is a good, some editions of Stockstead. I'm not sure if you need to look at them if you haven't already looked to see if this was in whichever edition you guys have accessed. I'm not sure if it's in the most recent one because I don't have that one, but it was for years illustrated, at least one big, large shot of it. So let's just say this, thinking ahead to, imagining, to living in a glass box. What can anybody just, what off the top of your head, can anybody think of any kind of disadvantages to living? Yeah.
High winds, blowing debris, extreme temperatures, warping the glass, any form of outside force. Glass can't really stand up to it as well as any wood or plaster.
Interesting. Yeah, I would agree with you for several reasons. But among the list of things, that short list you just gave us, I think the one that's most important that people should put in their notes is the temperature factor. But I would absolutely what you said is accurate, of course. However, this was tempered glass and it was 2 coats thick, and supposedly only a tree trunk in a hurricane or tornado rushing at, according to the architect. I don't know if that was ever, because they don't get many hurricanes. And this is in rural Connecticut, inland, not near the coast. But of course, they have had hurricanes that have hit New England. Actually, a big one in the 50s hit, but it didn't damage it. So it may be that the glass could be treated so it can resist, things, objects hitting it. But that is some risk. But the temperature, that second thing you mentioned, is the biggest of the 3 drawbacks. You can imagine what would happen to this house on a hot summer day. It's literally like a bake oven living in there. So of course it has air conditioning, but what would that lead to as a problem, a consequence? If you have to heat this house all summer, or maybe even starting in the spring or through the fall, because it's hot and humid if you don't know New England, it gets quite hot in the summer and even spring and early fall. What problem would that cause? Because that obviously the heat is something that might be dealt with air conditioning. But if you got your air conditioning on for 6 or 8 months out of the year, I think you guys get the idea, right?
Yeah, it would be incredibly expensive.
Expensive, yes. This house was outrageously expensive. Even back then, I think there was some recognition of that drawback, to the point where these guys' heating bills, heating in the winter and both, the 2 extremes, cooling and air conditioning in the summer, caused the bills to be like 10 times what the average house of this size bill. So that's one thing. Okay, there's another, which has to do with lifestyle. You notice that you could see everything on each side. You can imagine if you walked around it, wouldn't matter which side of the house or angle you're looking in. The only thing where there is any kind of closed off portion is this middle, rounded utility space, and possibly has a bathroom in it. Okay. But every other part of the house, what would be that drawback is open. A
No
lack of,
privacy.
yeah, right, exactly. A lack of privacy. Most people wouldn't want to live like this. So again, it only worked for people who were able to get large. This guy's house was on an 8 acre lot. Sorry, I have to say things more slowly. So 8 acres, okay, fine. Then you don't have to worry about your neighbors looking in at you. Especially if you have trees around it like this guy's lot. So it only worked for people with a lot of land. However, some of these glass boxes were built in places like, there's a couple in the Berkeley Hills. I don't know about Santa Rosa. I can't think of any in Sonoma County. There might be. Somewhere in Sonoma County, there probably is somewhere, because there were hundreds of these built. They were fashionable, and then people started having these problems with them once they moved in, right? Can anybody think of, what about if you've got a family with young children? Anybody think of a problem with that? I think
Children don't understand the concept of
Right.
glass.
Right. It could be severely dangerous and even possibly permanently disabling, if not remotely, but possibly even deadly. Yeah, I mean, little kids running into glass to them it looks like everything's just a big open playpen, and you just run outside and then wham. Oh yeah, concussions would be the least of it. So it's not practical for families with younger children. So there's all kinds of drawbacks, and it didn't catch on in a big way, but among certain kinds of home builders who had the land, and they had no concern about their heating bills if they were well off enough, and maybe no little children, then it could work. So this house itself, plus many other imitations of it, were illustrated all over the United States, mostly on magazine covers. I remember seeing, I think it was Life, might have been Look, one of those magazines doesn't exist, well, doesn't really exist anymore, which were read by millions of people every week, with color photos on the cover of this house. Maybe both of those. Those are the two largest magazines circulation wise. There were tens of millions of people that read those magazines. The paid subscriptions were over 10 million, and then people would pass them on. So obviously this had an impact visually on the entire culture, but it mostly is a limited potential for practical purposes. Among the majority of people could not. Where the most common examples of these are, if you drive down or whatever, you can't take the boat train. Maybe you can still fly to LA, and you go up to the Hollywood Hills. You'll see Frank Lloyd Wright houses up there, and if you care to, you can look at my book, and you'll see there's several famous ones that I had my photographer and I worked together on getting access to and photograph. They're not like this. He didn't do glass boxes. Wright didn't. But there's a bunch of glass box houses all over the Hollywood Hills. And some of them have been sites, don't write this, where the local police have had to knock on doors and threaten to arrest the people for exhibitionism or indecent exposure. Because when they were built, there were no neighbors, right? If they were built in the 40s and 50s, right? Well, the LA Hills were not that built up. But by the 90s or the aughts, you got neighbors looking in from each side. I think it's sadly ironic or unintended humor there. Anyway, no, I've read articles about that actually has happened. People have been, thinking they were forgetting that they were not alone up on a hill anymore, and suddenly being told they had to cease and desist their lifestyle or they'd be arrested. Okay, that's plenty on the meaning of this. This is a totally stable. I mean, there's not a dynamic line. Unless you count again, the top of this utility room, you could say that's the one dynamic section. But the house itself, the structure, completely right angles, straight lines everywhere. All the materials, actually the central utility core, you could guess is concrete, but that's smooth. They're real smooth textures, mostly glass, real smooth glass, and real smooth metal. The colors, no warm colors. It's neutral. Of course, no color on the glass, that's transparent, and neutral black on the walls. And then this is kind of a gray color on the concrete. For space, it's one big open rectangular floor plan with one enclosed central room. It's probably, I'm sure it's a bathroom. What else would it be? And then we have the rhythm, of course, with the framing of the glass, the exterior panels, right? Pretty much that is the rhythm. The framing of the house as well as the glass panels. Pretty obvious here. Yeah, there we go. All right, and then the shadows would be whatever the sun hits it at different times of the day would all be natural shadows from the sun. There's no technique for that. The largest mass was really one mass, I wouldn't say, and it's balanced. Now here, the central utility core is right dead in the middle. So it's balanced any way you look at it, I would say, even including the utility core. Left to right and top to bottom. And let's see, texture modeling. Oh, yeah, I mentioned space. Oh, by the way, it's a very small house. Well, it depends on your definition of small, but it's not a large space. It's about 1,000 square feet. I think it's more like 900. It's a little under 1,000 square feet. That's not very large but if it's just a couple, and it was just an artist and his wife, maybe they were both artists, I'm not sure, just two adults, that would be enough space, of course. Let's see, am I missing anything? I think you got, yeah, all that. All right, let's move on to, oh, I forgot. That's right. I remember now. I owe a debt of gratitude to my daughter, by the way. Just started her first job at Safeway. Loves it. I forgot that she helped me find this after I gave up. This is how it looks on the inside. So I am slightly off, and that is brick. Okay, so you got to say that that's warm. It doesn't look like it from here. In fact, you know what? I know the explanation for that because these pictures were taken many years apart. This is how it looked when it first opened, and that was covered over. The brickwork was was considered déclassé and cheap and even unattractive by some modern architects. Definitely, I remember reading things about it. No, don't use brick. So the brick was covered over for a long time, but then it is a more recent photograph. So you can see the one long rectangular room, obviously, and no privacy of any kind. I don't see how anyone could live like that, but some people do. So I guess you could say that there is a little bit of warmth. And now you can see the floor, which of course you couldn't before. So the floor has warm reddish colors on the tiles. Otherwise, everything I just gave you on the formal elements is completely accurate. Okay, and you can see, of course, here that the rhythm and the low ceilings too. Oh, I did mean to mention that on space. It's one long open rectangular space except for this section, which now that I think about it, the bathroom is this tiny little thing that you can see on the other side from that. That other photo is obviously taken from this side, near those trees or so. So you could see a door leading into a very tiny bathroom here. And on this side, it's an open hearth for a fireplace, of course, and a chimney flue. But anyway, so now you can see that it does have limited amount of, and how does the heating work in the winter? The coils, now this is Wright's idea, indirect heating. You have to write this, you've written enough by now, but the floor had buried heating coils underneath the tiles, and the tiles would radiate the heat. It's called radiated or radiant heat. Wright didn't maybe invent that because I think it was used in factories first, but he's the first architect to use it for homes. So again, this architect Johnson had a lot of owed a lot to Wright's earlier concepts. And one last thing about their rivalry. He once said of Frank Lloyd Wright, just before Falling Water, the house that made Wright again famous. He was already famous, then he was almost forgotten. It's true, almost forgotten for a while in the early 30s. He didn't do many buildings. It was a depression. Not a lot of people were commissioning expensive architecture then. And so Philip Johnson thought he was, being, satirical and said, oh, Frank Lloyd Wright. Yes, I remember him. One of the greatest architects of the 19th century, because his first buildings were from the 1890s when he was a young man. And then who remembers who better now? Johnson is not unknown, but nobody remembers him as much as Wright, of course. Okay, this fascinates me, but I think I gave you guys a break and took it off the list. I did, but just follow me here. I'm not going to spend more than a couple minutes on this. This is a church. Some of you might first look at it and say, what the heck is this? It's supposed to look like a water buffalo's horns, or water buffalo with its horns, and maybe the point of the if you can imagine it, it's a piece of sculpture. It's the point. It's a church by Le Corbusier. And you know what? It's the only Le Corbusier building I've ever seen. And I have seen the building. Again, it wasn't open. I didn't get to go into it. But I studied it. It's the only Le Corbusier building, don't write any of this, it's not on the syllabus, that I actually liked because it had color. You might say, where? Well, that's a bit of color. He also textured the roof line, and that's textured concrete, to look like bone, like the antlers, right? Of he called it wildebeest, the kind that you see in a lot of photography or filming of what are they called? The savannah in Africa would be where you would see animals like that. But the colors are here. You can't tell that from here. But if you go inside, I've seen documentaries on this building. Each of these windows has deeply set, obviously so deep you can't see the glass, different colored glass with primary colors, reds, greens, yellows, and blues. And they form nice shapes and colors on the walls when the sun is at the right angle. And here's your bell tower. See here, that's actually got a bell in it and a tiny little cross at the top. I think you can see it. Yeah, there. Now you can see the texture. So for this building, unlike all his other buildings, he used a variety of color, texture, material, some degree of warmth, and even some superfluous ornament. I mean, that doesn't have any function, right? I mean, why have the roof of a church? The bell tower is functional basically, but the roof is very much. In fact, guess who was inspired by this? Of course, Frank Gehry, to do some of his early buildings that you may have seen at least photos of, like the LA Symphony Hall in downtown Los Angeles, or now is it called Disney Symphony Hall? And of course, the Bilbao Museum in Spain and all the other museums and public buildings he ever built. Very similar to this. And this is called Notre Dame, like the one in Paris, but very different than that one. Notre Dame du Hall. You don't have to know this, but if you're curious to look it up on your own or for extra credit, D, right, U, and then H-A-U-T. That means Our Lady of the Highest, which is another way of saying Mary, Mother of Jesus. And he designed it for a conservative Catholic congregation. At first, they rejected the design, but then they'd hired him. And they had to know he was a very modern oriented architect. So they eventually got to where they liked it. They're proud of it now. They're guided tours. It's a national historic site in France, and it may be on the UNESCO World Heritage List. 1954. Le Corbusier died not long after this. Okay, now we get to know a must-know building. And this one, I think, is one that will resonate or ring a bell with whatever seemed familiar to most of you, unless you've never been to the downtown of a big American city. Not Santa Rosa. There aren't any of these buildings in Santa Rosa, but of course, San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, LA, San Diego, Portland, Seattle, or anywhere east of the West Coast, all over the world now. So here we go. This is an important slide. I'm not going to cut it from the study list. It's the architect is Mies van der Rohe. I mentioned his name earlier. I'll spell it again. And Johnson. So the two of them collaborated on this. The same guy that did the glass house. Okay, Mies, again, I'll spell it. His first name is M-I-E-S. And then next, it's German, so it's actually 4 words, right? The second word is van, V-A-N, and then the third is der, D-E-R, and his last name Rohe, O-R, capital R-O-H-E, and then Johnson, I've already spelled it, of course, like it's usually Johnson, J-O-H-N-S-O-N. The Seagram Building, if you've ever enjoyed liquors from the Seagram Company, they're still very successful international liquor distributors and sales company. Seagram, S-E-A-G-R-A-M, Seagram Building, 1958. This is the first all glass and steel box, one of. You can't see the first. There's ways to debate that. Just say one of the first, and certainly the first famous glass and steel box or Bauhaus / international skyscraper in the United States. It started a trend. I personally don't like this trend, but it's with us. And, there are exceptions where every style that you can think of any art, not just architecture, of course, there are variations within that style. And of course, it's gotten to be much more varied. There's much greater variety, is what I'm saying, with the glass and steel Bauhaus style buildings now than there was in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s. So this is an early example of Bauhaus in America, is the other way to look at it. It's one of the first Bauhaus, if not the first, certainly the first famous one in the United States. And it's by one of the founders of the school, as I already mentioned. That's part of the meaning. If this were on the essay part of the final, you'd want to mention that. He had been an instructor of architecture at the Bauhaus school in Germany, and then the school was closed by Hitler. He left and moved to first Chicago and then New York. So it's the headquarters of a major corporation. Seagram Liquors was already pretty big. In fact, they survived Prohibition because, oh well, you don't need to know that. They managed to ship their liquor across the border from Canada, where there was no Prohibition, into various parts of the United States. They weren't supposed to, but they did. So they are a very successful company. They're still around. And yet, when this building opened, it hasn't changed really. There were some people who noticed this as part of the meeting now. There is nothing to greet the workers who go to this building every day of the work week, well, some of them on weekends, but let's say, every work day. And they have to cross this barren concrete plaza with no decorations, no color, no living objects, no artwork, no nothing. And that's not accidental. That's a deliberate concept that I mentioned earlier. So if you didn't write before, now you do need to on this slide because it has at least a fair chance of being on the final, which is the concept of less is more is what this whole plaza and the building. So it's all designed by Mies, the space in front of it and the building itself. He didn't want ornaments, decoration, color, variety, let alone actual artwork to distract the workers while they were going to work, because they're just supposed to focus on being good little workers. I'm being extra facetious here, but I think you get my point. The concept behind it is no accident, that there is nothing to delight the eye of any beholder of this building. You're just supposed to go to work there and be quiet and do your job in your cubicle, whatever space they gave you, and then take your elevator down and go home. In other words, it's not typical anymore of even these kind of skyscrapers. Usually now, glass and steel box architecture has something in at least the lobby, if not outside in a plaza. And most of them have space around them, like green space, right? And maybe plants, trees, grass, or bushes, and sculpture, large public sculpture, or smaller, things that you can look at as you walk into the building, and then usually something in the lobby. This doesn't. Deliberately, it is, the word I'd use is barren. You don't have to use that word if you don't agree, but it definitely has nothing to delight the eye of the beholder, and that's no accident. It's part of the concept behind it. And in case that doesn't get the point across of how different, I'm not saying there's no reason you would have to agree. If you like this building, more power to you. You can get an A and say that. Don't worry. I've had students say, "Oh, but what if I like it? Am I going to get an F on that answer if I say I like it and it's on the final?" No, of course not. But look at what this is here. Does anybody know the original movie Ghostbusters, right? Not the remake. That was so. The one with Bill Murray and Dan Aykroyd, right? 1980s. Some of you must have seen it. Anyway, they use that building at the end, and they walk up the stairs. And why am I even pointing to it? Besides it's being completely different, it's an Art Deco skyscraper. It's exactly the same number of stories, 40. These are both 40 stories. And I think someone even measured the interior square footage, almost identical space. And it functions just as well as the day it was opened in 1928. So 30 years earlier, we have two buildings almost facing each other, a couple blocks, 3-4 blocks apart, same part of New York, Manhattan, right? Similar functions, similar concepts in terms of what the building's purpose is, but very different stylistically. This has something to delight the eye of the beholder. Now, not everybody likes Art Deco, but it definitely has decorations, color, variety of texture. In that movie, by the way, the last or next to the last scene, the two main characters are going up the staircase and they look at all the gargoyles along decorative detailing along the staircases and near the elevators, and they go, Art Deco, American style, 1925 to 1945. Yeah, they can comment on the style of the building because it's so different than everything around it. You can see all the others, almost all the other high rises, right, or glass and steel boxes, as most of the skylines of most modern American, most big American cities are. So you can't deny the influence that this had. And for better or for worse, whatever your opinion is, notwithstanding, this definitely started a trend that is still with us. Okay, let's do a formal analysis. And here's what we'll do. We're going to still end quite early, but we still have 1, 2, 3. That's not that many slides. We'll take an extra early break, and let's keep it to 15 minutes, not 20. Does everybody agree with that? Okay, and then we'll still end easily 40 minutes early, maybe even more than that. But let's wrap up this slide and then take a break until 8:05, and then we should be done about 8:40, 8:35, 8:40. Okay, or even 8:30-ish. All right, so this is a glass and steel box. So of course it's completely stable, nothing dynamic about it. All the lines or angles, shapes of it everywhere are entirely stable. It for space I mentioned, but I don't think, yeah, you probably were writing then, so you should write now. It's a 40-story tall skyscraper with various sizes of offices on each floor. That's all you have to write. The rhythm is obvious with the, bands of, they're called banded again, windows, right? You can just see, walls of windows, if you prefer that, actually what each level is. And the color is neutral. It is completely black, painted over black, colors over metal, and of course transparent glass. The real textures are only the two that you can see in this slide: real smooth glass and real smooth metal. And of course you have obviously the rhythm of each floor, pretty much the same. Oh yeah, and it does have these pylon kind of interest. So that's a little bit like the Corbusiers house there, and also Wright did that too. By the way, Frank Lloyd Wright invented the carport, by the way, among many other things. And those are almost always, with those posts that raise, right? The carport's on the ground floor and the living space are above. So that creates kinds of rhythm. Of course, for modeling, this is a nighttime view. Actually, I'm glad I showed it to you because it does look better in this view than it does when the sun's hitting it. It's just a dull, dark gray color. It almost looks warm because of the lights inside, but don't be fooled by that. That's the lights inside the offices. People working late. This must be winter. The building doesn't have any warmth naturally in and of itself. So the lines are all visual. It's completely symmetrical, left to right, of course, and top to bottom. It's a single mass. I don't think you can break it. Okay, here we go. Hello? Yeah, we are just, what we're doing is finishing up with this slide, which is Mies van der Rohe and Johnson. It's the fourth one down on your list for week 15. And it's the Seagram Building, 1958. So I can repeat everything because everyone else heard it, but we're just finishing the form analysis. And then we're going to take an early break, but don't go away because of the 3. That's all we have. We're going to end extra early. But I definitely kind of need to get a brief break. Let's keep it to 15 minutes. The last 3, one of those might be on the final. They're all late modern architecture, and I think you'll see why they have some relevance. You may even recognize a couple of them. But let's wrap this up quickly and then take a break. So again, the colors are neutral. I mean, it's just painted black and then a transparent glass, of course. And let's see, am I forgetting anything? Line, right? Modeling, balance, it's stable, pretty much covered everything. And I mentioned the 40 stories for the space, the actual wheel height. By the way, it's about 450 feet tall, but you don't have to, you can just say 40 stories. Okay, I'm going to call it 7:52. So let's take 15-minute break and resume at, let's see, that would be 8:07. Or very close to that. Okay, so I'm going to pause the recording. If anyone has any questions, because a couple people joined a little after we got started, like the last person, I'll stick around here at the start of the break, and if you want me to answer questions. And of course, at the end, I always do that. Okay, pause recording. All right. Let's resume where we left off. So, yeah, there we go. Hi, Robin. Welcome. Okay, we're just starting this. It's not going to be half. It's going to at most a third of the total this evening, and I'm going to still have about, it might be 2, maybe 3 slides we didn't cover last week. That'd be the Eiffel Tower and the Crystal Palace. That is going to take me some time to find good quality images of. I've just been too busy with grading late papers and dealing with my daughter's first getting her to work and all the other stuff for her first job. She doesn't have a car yet. She just started this week. So I will be able to add those, which are on the syllabus. I'm not adding any slides to the syllabus. And next week, speaking of adding or subtracting, we're going to cut the list down. You don't want to miss next week's class. I will send everyone a reminder because that will tell you what you don't need to even think about in terms of what to study or not study for the final. As promised in the introduction to the syllabus, I put it in writing, so it's an ironclad promise. I will cut during the review 50% of the total slides. That's quite a bit. But for now, everyone that's on syllabus, of course, that you take notes on, assume it could be on the final. So let's move forward now to our next must know. This might look familiar if you've ever flown out of New York's JFK airport. It's still used for its original purpose, which is as a terminal for international flights. It's no longer the TWA terminal because that's what it was built for, but there is no TWA airline anymore. They went bankrupt. I think it was after 9/11. In any case, here's the next must know, and the title of it is, just like I was saying, 3 capital letters, TWA terminal. The architect's name is Sarinen, and that's SAARINEN. And this is 1963. So we start with the fact that Errol Sarinen was Finnish, as in from Finland. And he became one of the most successful of the mid-20th century American architects, even though he was he was born in Finland, but he also was trained there, educated there, and started his career there. Then he moved to the United States, like many people did after World War II, and had a whole very, very successful career. You may have, some of you, seen St. Louis Gateway Arch. It's 650 feet tall. It's concrete arches that look like they're going to go across the Mississippi, but they actually don't. They're on the banks of the Mississippi at St. Louis. It's literally almost halfway across the continent that we're meant to symbolize. They're called the St. Louis Gateway Arches. He designed those. So Sarinen was very successful, very popular in America, even though he was born, raised, trained, and began his career in Finland. That happened with a lot of architects. I already mentioned Mies van der Rohe before the break, right? And Walter Gropius from Germany. But there's a difference with him. He had a style he called organic. That is a phrase that gets used a lot. And so just to say what he meant by it was something relating to living things. His buildings had some kind of feature or detailing that made them reminiscent of living things. Now, at first glance, it might not seem obvious, but if you start looking more closely at this photo, I think you begin to get the idea. This is a terminal for international flights. Now it's just called the International Terminal at JFK Airport in New York City. It's part of the main, that's where it is. One of the busiest airports in the world, of course. And he decided that he wanted to make this building look like a kind of living creature, as in a bird, right? And make it appear as though it was landing or taking off, at the moment in which a bird with very large or wide wings is literally stretching their wings out to come in for a landing or take off, either one. So it's supposed to look like an eagle, a gigantic concrete eagle. At first glance, it might not seem obvious, but the more you look at it, I think you begin to get the idea that there is some evidence for that, or some, visual influence from that. These are the wings. This is the body, and this would be the beak here and the legs. He did that with a lot of his architecture. He's not the only one, but he's one of the ones that did that. Anthropomorphic is another word some of you know. You don't have to use that word if you don't want. It's a long one, hard to spell. I'm not going to spell it for you, but sort of phonetic. Anthropomorphic, but that implies something that is like animals being used for human-like behavior or depicted in human-like behavior. So I wouldn't use that word, frankly, but some people have. So organic is better. It's um, biomorphic isn't there's the other word you could use. Biomorphic, meaning shaped or formed by living things. He liked doing that because he wanted buildings to have some feeling of life or liveliness to them. This does. I think it does. I like this building when I first saw it on the news. And there's another fact about the meaning. It's one of the last things Jackie Kennedy ever did before she watched her husband get, well, you know what, in Dallas, right? Before she was there that day with him. Literally, I think it was like maybe a month, but probably less. Shortly before her husband was assassinated, she went to New York to open this terminal as it was completed. And that is the year, of course, Kennedy was assassinated. And she was there in like October, or early November. So just very shortly before, a few weeks, you could say, before her husband was assassinated, Jackie was asked, because, first ladies are often asked to do things on their own, of course, without always having to have their husband around. With them at that moment. So she actually, and it made the news because the building was so unusual, first of all. Errol Sarinen was already becoming famous as an architect with a national reputation. And Jackie, anything she did, Jackie Kennedy, while she was first lady or even after, got news coverage. So she was asked, I suppose the mayor of New York asked her to come inaugurate the building, right? Instead of a battleship with a bottle of champagne, she just opened the building and, stood in front of it. I remember seeing it on the news. So this building became instantly famous because of all those reasons. The architect himself and his reputation, the design of it, the innovative, biomorphic is really the right word to use. Yeah, that's the right word. You can say organic, but organic, Wright used that term. We covered that last week, so that could be confusing. So probably better if it's, I'm not saying it will be, not removed from the study list. Biomorphic, one word, Biomorphic, of or having to do with living things, designed with a living thing in mind. And in this case, it's supposed to be a giant winged bird, and really most people would say just an eagle landing, right? Or taking off, or either at different times of the day, of course. And today it is still used as an international terminal for one of the largest airports in the world, JFK in New York City. Okay, and also the materials are very modern, and he was one of those who experimented with using concrete in different ways, and that's how he was able to conceive the idea of a giant bird, or in this case specifically an eagle, made out of concrete, and yet make the concrete feel like it was moving or alive. At least that's how he intended it to be perceived, or to have people react to it that way. I've seen it from across, taking a taxi into the airport to fly my first time to London across the Atlantic. I remember seeing this. It was already, pretty famous. It's like 10 years after it was built. And I remember seeing it and thinking, yeah, it does look like a giant bird coming in for a landing. Okay, so that's the whole meaning. Formal analysis, well, it's an off-white kind of cool gray color. And there inside it's got, though, you can write this because it's got gold. Anybody ever see the cartoon series, The Jetsons? I don't know if you may have just heard of it. Some say they were inspired, that series, to some of the designs of some of the spaces or whatever places that family, supposedly a future family. And the series was from the 70s, I think. Yeah, maybe it was 60s. Anyway, the point is it was inspired by, some say, this building, because inside here, which you can't see because of the reflection on the glass, there is gold everywhere, on the ceiling, on the staircases, the railings, of course, of the staircase. It's not real gold, but the color gold. So inside it has warm colors of gold, and outside it's cool off-white. The materials, the textures are all real. There's no similar textures. Real smooth glass and metal on the windows, and real rough concrete. The concrete is fairly rough and untreated here. There's modeling. In this case, it's part of the design. The deep shadows underneath the, quote, head, this part of the eagle, and with visible inside from the two wings, literally both, architectural wings and the wings of the design of the eagle. That creates, of course, shadows from natural sunlight. And then there's the visual lines of the window framing and, of course, the edges. It is totally dynamic. There's not a straight line in it. Even the window framing veers out, as you can see, right, at an angle. And these aren't the same width. These veer out, again, each of the frames. So there isn't really a single straight line or right angle in it. It's totally dynamic. I would say it's a single mass, but you can't quite say that because what is this here? Yeah, look at these cars. It's probably taken like a few months after it opened. This is the auto rental sections of all the different automobile rental companies. That's what these are for, plus, of course, offices. And that's part of the design of the building. So you'd have to say it's really, you could say 3 masses, but 2 relatively, 2 sizes. The largest mass is the central section, the terminal proper, of course. And then the other 2 side wings are the second largest masses. And then we have, let's see, for space, yeah, this is about a 40-foot high ceiling. It's quite spacious inside when you stand there looking up, as I have done. The entranceway is about 20 feet, the height of it. So it goes all the way up to 40 feet at the highest point inside, and then much smaller lower ceilings or smaller spaces. It's one big open space in here, by the way, in the terminal. And the smaller spaces, of course, are the auto rental dealerships or offices, right? Sorry. Okay, let's see. Balance, totally symmetrical if you draw a line down the middle, and depends on where you draw it, top to bottom, but you can make the case that it's roughly equal if you draw the line at a certain point. Side to side, it also could be considered balanced top to bottom. Okay, modeling, color, I think we covered everything. Texture, okay, let's move on to... Now, we don't often talk about modern Japanese architecture in a lot of these classes, so I really wanted to include this particular slide. But because of the length of, each week's lectures and how many slides there already were, I'll try to give you guys a break, of course. So I'm not going to require you to take notes on this, and I'm not going to spend very long on it, but just take a quick look at what this building is. It was from the Tokyo Olympics. Now, are they going to have the Olympics this summer? I don't know. Tokyo's having a problem, but I think they will. They haven't said they're canceling them. What is that, 2 months from now? They're supposed to, right? Start the Summer Olympics in Tokyo in July. Anyway, so this was a building built by an architect. You'll have to know this, Kenzo Tange. He's he passed away just a few years ago. Tange, a Japanese architect who worked all over the world, but he was most of his commissions were in Japan. And this is the water sports site, right? It's where all the swimming and other water-related sporting events were held and judged, of course, with audiences. Now, let's see. I don't remember if there's no interior view of it. I have one in my old slide trace, but anyway, I can tell you I've never been to Japan, but inside, this is a really impressive space. But the outside was the main reason I'm even showing it to you, though it's not on syllabus. It's supposed to look like the prow of an old wooden Japanese warship, the kind we're talking about way before, World War I, before the Japanese Navy sank the entire Russian Navy in 1905 off the coast of Japan, or was it Korea? I just saw a Netflix series I can recommend it called The Last Tsars. It's quite well done. And my daughter being Russian, I think I told you, it's fascinating. I think she'll want to see the parts on Rasputin. It's well done, filmed on location. And one of the chapters or episodes is about the disastrous battle or war between Russia and Japan, where the Japanese were brand new world military power, and they just wiped out the Russian Navy in it was like in an hour. They sank all the big lumbering battleships. So we're not talking about the Japanese early metal battleships, but they're ancient, hundreds of years old, if not 1,000 or more years old, wooden warships that they used to defend their coast and, of course, to have battles with each other. And if you look at it closely enough, you can see how the architect was thinking like that. Right, the prow of the ship as it's or maybe this is the oars coming out from, of course, the crew that's rowing across the Sea of Japan. That's what it's called, off the coast of Japan. And then this is, of course, the parking, maybe not obvious, the parking area and a ramp for people to arrive, and dignitaries and important people, the judges and what have you, and the press, to come into the building and start recording the events. Yeah, it was a very popular site for the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, and it's still being used as a public site for water sports events, contests. It may be reused for the I do know which century it is. I'm sorry. For the 2020, now it's 2021. Of course, they were obviously postponed. Summer Olympics. It could easily be, because I think that the Olympics in Tokyo are going to be held near, well, they have multiple sites. Most of them do. So it could be this is just one of the off-site main, sites, and maybe just used for a few events, or it could be just they'll only keep it as a what's it called, urban recreational site for people in the city of Tokyo to enjoy, as they have been ever since it was used first for the Olympics. Okay, now we get to a slide that is definitely part of the syllabus, an important one. This is Piano and Rogers. Yeah, I know it's like the word for the musical instrument, Piano and Rogers. The architects, okay, they were their last names of the two architects, and the name of it is Pompidou Center. It's a French museum, art museum. Pompidou, Pompidou. That's what the name of a former president of France. Last name, Pompidou Center, 1977. Now we get to, in a way, I should have put it on the syllabus, but I'm not going to add new definitions. You have the list already printed, and you don't need to add another last new one. But this is the last concept, let's say, or artistic term that I'm going to give you, which is part of the meaning you should write now for this slide. This is one of the first, some would say the first large public postmodern building. Just like it sounds, postmodern architecture is a phrase you probably heard. And if you're not familiar with the concept, it's all around us. If you go back, whenever we get back to the main campus to have in-person class, by the way, I'm actually maybe going to be allowed to teach an in-person class in the fall. They're negotiating between the administration and the art department. They've offered me one, but it might not get approval, because of the decision by Dr. Chong and the administration at first not to have any large in-person classes. But if they do, I hope I'll see a few of you. Maybe it's not the same class, it's Art 2.1. So it covers ancient art, very different subject matter. And I have slides from all over the world, Egypt, Rome, Greece, places that are, and even Atlantis. I was in Atlantis. I'll explain if you ever take that class. It's Art 2.1. If it's offered, it'll be a Wednesday evening class, same time frame as this. And if they don't allow it, it'll be in person. It'll probably be online. Anyway, so this is, I'll repeat that, one of the first and the first famous large, you have to say it that way. There were smaller examples. The first famous large example of postmodern architecture. And what is that? Here we go. That's the main part of the meaning. How do you recognize a building as postmodern? Postmodernism, it's a style of architecture that reintroduces a variety of shapes, colors, and materials with some whimsical, humorous detail. Historical, I'll be all right. With some, you could say humorous or whimsical is a better word, with some whimsical historic detailing. I'll say it again. It's a style of modern architecture that reintroduces a variety of shapes, colors, and materials combined with some whimsical historical details. That's what the student building, the cafeteria building, whatever you guys call it, on the main campus at Santa Rosa JC is a postmodern building where we used to all go to eat lunch if you were on campus during lunchtime last 2 years, a year and a half ago, whatever. And there are other buildings that are postmodern all over the Bay Area, but that's what most of you would be familiar with. take a look at it. It's got some decorative detail on it, which is not typical of any of the other modern glass and steel buildings, right, from all the previous decades, going all the way back to early Bauhaus. So this is not, some people call this Bauhaus turned inside out. That you could write if you want, because in a way it is, but it's much more than that. Now, this picture is slightly misleading because you see where the arrow is? I don't know if they painted it or if it's just before. I think this picture was taken when it was first opened. That is now red. That is, I couldn't find a picture that showed that the way it really looks. So there is a variety of colors. The windows are blue and yellow, and the caterpillar, and it is meant to imitate a caterpillar. I can't speak, caterpillar, which is supposed to be winding or sliming, if you will, worming its way up the side of the building. And of course, it's to protect people when they don't want to take the elevator and wait because there are long lines inside to get into this. So what is this building? It's the Museum of Modern Art for Paris. It's Paris's Museum of Modern Art. We have one, we call it MoMA. It's in San Francisco. Every big city has one now, practically every big city all over the world. The concept of a museum of modern art, but they don't call it that. They call it the Pompidou Center because they're naming it after the president of France who helped create it, the museum and the building. I think he died before it opened, but in any case, he's the previous president of France. I mean, he might have lived just long enough to see it open. So that's why it's called the Pompidou Center. So this now, I don't know what else to tell you, but just in your notes, when you do the formal analysis, I'll reiterate that fact, is painted red. That's concrete. That's the foundation for the, of course, glass and hard plastic. That's what it is. Covered escalator. It's an escalator. So you can go all the way up to the 6th floor and get off and go inside the building without having to go through the huge long lines and wait for elevators. You know, some people don't like elevators. And you got views from here that are spectacular of the whole city of Paris. There's Notre Dame. See the towers of Notre Dame right there. Right, which is, even though we didn't cover it in this class, one of the most famous buildings in the world. So it's in one of the oldest neighborhoods in Paris, across the river from the Eiffel Tower, which you can't see here because it's off on this side. And it's the only modern building in that neighborhood. And then it's got some whimsical detailing here, borrowed from ocean liners, from Art Deco era ocean liners. That's the historical, whimsical historical motifs. You've ever seen the Queen Mary? A few of you, maybe, if you ever go to Southern California, it's in Long Beach, in the harbor in Long Beach. It's a ship that was one of the most, well, the most luxurious ocean liner while it was, in service, and now it's a museum. That ocean liner and all the other Art Deco era ocean liners have these giant, oddly shaped, right, smokestacks. Not just the functional ones that stick straight up and are just, rounded. These are on the decks of a lot of the 1930s ocean liners, but especially the more luxurious ones like the Queen Mary. And that's clearly a reference to decades earlier, like 50 years earlier. Those ships were made in the 20s. So this building is 70. So it is an early postmodern building because it reintroduces color. Again, the windows, you can almost see from here, but it's kind of misleading. This is a gray day. They actually have panels within the framing, between each window frame. The panels are alternating yellow and blue. And this must be when it was just still, not quite completed or finished, because they must have added those features. I've been to this building many times, and as recently as the early aughts, and it definitely had red concrete underneath the escalator, painted red, I guess, and then panels, and I think they were metal panels of yellow and blue alternating colors on the windows. And then you can see some color here. Of course, there's red and orange along this section here, and at the top here, this is some kind of service, I guess, probably the elevator shafts. Okay, and so you see the historical, whimsical motifs of the Art Deco ocean liner smokestacks. Okay, so that marks this as the first famous example, and it set off a whole trend of people deciding why. They were sick and tired, many architects and their clients, many parts of the world, people were tired of glass and steel boxes over and over and over. They wanted something more interesting to look at. And so it's directly a result of the reaction. Some would say rejection, that might be too strong, but a reaction against the less is more philosophy, or that buildings should only have the shape or form follows function of their purpose. And instead that it's okay to have something to delight the eye of the beholder, to go back to Louis Sullivan's concept from the 1890s when he designed some of the oldest skyscrapers. And that's his definition of what a good building should be. And of course, that had no role, we've already covered just now tonight, right before the break. It had no role. The use of ornament and varieties of color and textures and materials were not at all involved in the Bauhaus school. It was the exact opposite. So this is a rejection of that, except that it is glass and steel. That's why some people think it looks like a variation on, or some kind of strange riff, off of, or tangent off of Bauhaus. You could make that case, but I don't see it that way. It's much more variety of things to look at when you're standing down below looking up at it. It's definitely not a boring building. Some people hate it. Some people don't like it. Oh, when it was built, the people in that neighborhood, you could see, look at these old buildings here. They're 500 years old. Some of these, not all of the people in the neighborhood wanted that building in their own backyard, but obviously it got built. It's a very popular museum of modern art, still functioning exactly as it was designed. All right, so let's do a formal analysis. We'll do just one more slide and then we'll end early. Okay, so it's balanced. Yes, it is completely symmetrical, and it is both stable and dynamic. The building itself is stable, but these escalators, and that's another set of escalators, clearly, obviously, look at them, are multiple, and as are these. By the way, these are ventilation outlets for the actual services, of the steam and the heat and air conditioning inside the building. They're not just for decorative purposes. The conduits underneath this plaza here that reach over pipelines, of course, that go under the concrete. Okay, so this has, some dynamic detailing on the escalators and the ventilation shafts. That's what they actually are. You can just say smokestacks because that's what they're supposed to mimic. And then most of the structure proper, the actual facade, is stable. There's no larger, well, you could break it down and say the building itself is the largest mass, then the escalators, and then the smokestacks or ventilation shafts, if you want to break it down that way. Okay, and then we have, let's see, balanced left to right and top to bottom. I don't think, unless you get too technical here with this. Well, it covers the entire facade. There's this strange looking worm-like covered escalator. So I just say it's stable. I meant balance, both top to bottom, halfway 3 stories above, 3 below, and left to right, symmetrical. For space, it's a 6-story building with ceilings that are about 12 feet high inside. So the whole thing is about 70 feet tall. And each floor is divided into different size exhibit rooms, of course, as museums always are, and offices. Texture's all real. It's real hard plastic, real concrete, real glass, and real steel. And these are hard plastic too, by the way, these ventilation shafts. Okay, the modeling is just the shadows from the sun. And then we have the lines are all visual here. There's no painted or drawn line on the window framing mostly. Well, actually the lines on the metal grating here. Or you could say framing because this is more decorative. So it more supports the weight of the walkways here or the escalators. So it's not really the structure that's on the inside. So of course the line is all visual. All right, let's move on and do one more. And then I'll stick around and answer any extra questions you have. If you've been to Portland, many of you must have, you might not have realized what you were looking at if you drove by this building or even saw it from a distance. It's the Portland City Hall, but they don't call it that. So it's the next must know on this list. Now we'll make it our last must know for tonight. The architect's name is Graves. Boy, is that a misnomer. He had a sense of humor and whimsy about him. I liked everything I read about him or heard him interviewed. He just died about 2 or 3 years ago. Yeah. Graves, Peter, I think was the first name, Graves, just like the word Graves was the name of the last name of the architect. The title of this is Portland, like the city in Oregon, of course, Portland Services, plural, Building. Portland Services Building, 1982. So why are we looking at this particular example of postmodernism? Because it is the first major postmodern public building in the United States. That's a pretty important fact. It's the first major postmodern public building in the United States. So that style starts in Europe, in I think it's both England and France where it first appeared, maybe a little bit in Germany, and then it came over to the United States. But there are others who argue with that and say, oh no, they were being used, the postmodern concepts I just defined, that remember the features of that style apply to this slide. So I don't need to repeat all those, but I'll show you where they fit in just a minute as we finish with the meeting. But just to finish that point, there are historians who say that isn't accurate because there were some postmodern exhibits at the 74, there we go, 1974 Spokane World's Fair. What? Spokane, Washington, out in the middle of nowhere. I know that town. I have relatives on my wife's side up there. Yeah, there are buildings that use a variety of color and texture and things in the mid to late 70s in the US, but they were not, they're all torn down. First of all, World's Fairs buildings, what do? They always tear every one of them down. Maybe they leave one standing. And there's nothing left that I've ever seen in that city, Spokane, where they actually did have a World's Fair. Hardly anybody came to it in 1974. So you could just say there were some early examples, let's keep it simple, of a postmodern style influence in some temporary buildings in the US before this. But again, I'll repeat that this is, nobody really argues with us, the first major public building to use the postmodern style. Excuse me, I'm going to take a drink of coffee in the United States, period. Okay, what makes it postmodern? Well, you can't not notice, and when you glance at it, a variety of color, right? Look at this, about 5 different colors. Aquamarine, right here. Very light yellow, Yellowstone it's called, which is the same color as many cathedrals stonework in medieval European cathedrals. And then a kind of a rust red, and then a bluish tint to this, glass. The glass itself is tinted, and then almost purplish tan varying into purple on the upper detail. That is something I'm going to ask if anyone here can guess what that's supposed to symbolize at the end of the comments here on the meeting. So yeah, you got like 5 different colors here. Obviously the materials are different. There's glass. This is textured concrete. These are again smooth painted concrete, and then this is marble there down on the ground floor. So you've got a variety of materials, and of course there's a variety of shapes. Now it's overall a rectangular building. You could say it's a cube, but obviously it's not a simple, straightforward cube. You've got projecting details on the facade, and then of course almost a ziggurat, like Babylonian step pyramids, right? The kind that set backwards from the ground floor up, almost like a Babylonian or early Egyptian pyramids were that way too. So an Egyptian or Babylonian pyramid shape on the first 3 floors. So obviously there's a variety of shapes, textures, and materials. And then the whimsical part, the historical motif, you might ask, well, where is that? This statue is of the mythical Portlandia, but that's not what makes it whimsical, although it does kind of a giant statue you have to walk under when you go to City Hall to pay a bill or complain or file a, get a building permit, whatever. It's the City Hall where the mayor's offices and the city council and all the usual things the City Hall building has, but they just call it Portland Services. This is meant to symbolize what goes on in the building. Now, I wish it was a bit more direct, straight, or head-on view, but I think maybe 1 or 2 of you can guess what it's supposed to symbolize. Okay, let's say you're going to see the mayor. And of course, he has the power over you of granting your permit or your request, whatever it is. This might look like some kind of ancient person from the ancient world, and the hints of it, of where we're talking about, are at the bottom. when I mentioned the two cultures from the ancient world that used stepped pyramids. Oh, well, it's not obvious. It's supposed to look like a pharaoh's headdress, as in the man inside, the mayor, the one who runs this building and the city supposedly is the local pharaoh. It's meant to make people stop and think about that. Is there a parallel? Well, most mayors don't have anywhere near the power that a pharaoh in ancient Egypt did, but they have some power over people and their lives. So he's making a whimsical comment here. The architect Graves is meant to be slightly sarcastic or satirical, however you want to see it. The sarcastic to me is a little more negative than satirical. It's meant more good humored, but he's using whimsy here. Again, and a historical influence of Art Deco era influences, because Art Deco is a style that used Egyptian motifs very, very openly. So you didn't have any guess about them. And here he's just sort of hinting at that influence from ancient pyramids on the first three floors, which are the step pyramid motifs, and then the headdress type decorative detailing on the upper floors. Put together, he's implying that this is where you go see the local pharaoh and ask for his or her help. The woman is mayor now. No, it's a guy. Yeah, that's right. They're having an election. There's a man named Wheeler, I think, is mayor now. Anyway, it's a city I know quite well because my wife's family has several members that live within a few miles of Central Portland, and this building is very popular. By the way, it has an open 3-story atrium with a waterfall and mature redwood trees growing up into a skylight that is actually the whole height. So some of the trees are as tall as the building. The waterfall is 3 stories, that's right. So it's like a very large open atrium and then a more narrow skylight for, I think it's like half a dozen giant redwoods that grow all the way up into the skylight. That's unusual, and of course very appropriate because it's in Oregon, the Northwest, where of course such vegetation is quite common. I think they're redwood. They might be, now that I think about it, all I know is that they're very large evergreen trees, and they dominate the lobby, and that's part of the design, and that was part of the concept created by the architect Graves. So you see why I said his name doesn't really do him justice. He wasn't depressive, downbeat person. He had a whimsical sense of humor. And that's why he was picked to design this building, because he had already done some small scale postmodern things that were temporary for maybe even the ones in Washington, which is next door, right? The Spokane World's Fair. Okay, that's plenty on the meeting. Let's do a formal analysis, and then again, we'll call it a night a little early, but don't forget we still have 3 more must-knows, 2 from last week we didn't get to, and the very last one we're going to spend a little time on, the Pyramids of the Louvre, one of my favorite postmodern structures. And if you ever go to Paris, you can't miss them. They're right on the river. But we'll start with that, and then we'll do the Eiffel Tower and the Crystal Palace, and then we'll segue into reviewing for the final. So you don't want to miss next week's class. All right, wrapping it up, formal analysis. This is balance left to right. No question. It's cubical shape, and of course the width is, but you could, I better modify that. It's slightly wider on the bottom 2 levels, slightly wider. So you could say it's unbalanced toward the bottom, though it feels balanced because of these projecting balconies here. I don't know if the mayor ever stands out there and waves to the crowds like Mussolini used to do, but that's what those are. Those are balconies, which I don't know if they're functioning balconies or not. But they're not, big enough to match the width of this. So you could say it's slightly unbalanced toward the bottom and definitely completely balanced or symmetrical left to right. The rhythm should be obvious. The windows, of course, the projecting balconies, these are called pylons, which are very Egyptian. That word is Egyptian. Pylons on the outside of Egyptian temples, concrete projections called pylons. Of course, they didn't have concrete in Egypt. They were made out of stone. And so there's a lot of rhythm there also with the 3 extending right levels on the ground, first 3 floors. And then we have the textures, real smooth concrete, a real smooth glass. And this stone is fairly smooth. I remember getting up close and taking a close-up photo of it. So those are real smooth stone, real smooth glass. and real smooth concrete, but there's and glass, of course, here. There is also real smooth marble on the first 3 floors, but there is the rough concrete of the pylons. It's textured, so it's not smooth. So there is one real rough texture. There's no simulated textures here. There's no modeling on this view. Typical overcast day in Portland. But when the sun shines, of course, that's only natural modeling created by the shadows of the sun. Visual lines are around the edges of the building, of course, and these pylons create visual lines, but there's no painted or carved lines visible here. Colors are warm on the main walls and on the textured concrete. Well, actually, all 3 sections here of the exterior concrete, and then, of course, neutral on the windows, and then cool on the marble of the first tiles. Actually, is what they're made out of, marble tiles on the first 3 floors. So those are cool. And then for space, it's a 18-story building. I remember now. I almost had it memorized. 18-story building with a large open skylight or atrium. You can say it either way. Atrium means an open space with a skylight at the top. It's a Roman concept, so it says a very large one. The whole height of the building, and then literally, hundreds of offices around the rest of the building, different sizes, of course. And then let's see, stable mostly, except for the balconies, and this headdress is supposed to look like the pharaoh's headdress, projecting out at diagonal lines. So that portion at the top is supposed to look like the 2 sides of the pharaoh's headdress, and his face would be here, right? That's the idea behind this anyway. So that's the only really dynamic section, is the upper decorative features, the whimsical headdress area. And then we have, of course, let's see, am I forgetting anything? Texture, space. I think that's everything. Visual. Mass. Sorry, last thing. The largest mass, well, I would break it down into 2 main masses. That's up to you to decide. But the upper floors, the upper 15 floors, if you count as the main section of the building, there would be a single mass. It would be the largest, of course. And then if you count this as 3 floors as another single mass, because they're visually unified by the material and the color of those 3 floor exteriors, that would be the second largest mass. And then I guess maybe the balconies. Okay, we've ended at 8:50. So you guys, obviously get to have a little, I hope you do, a little bit of free time that you can use wisely. But I'm going to stick around now, as always, and see if anyone has any questions about your grades, extra credit, late papers. Like I said, I still have in both my classes few people that haven't turned in their second paper. So if that's the case for anybody or you yourselves, anyone listening to, or who hears this on YouTube, which it'll be posted by 8 p.m. on Friday, if not sooner. You want to get that done this week and get it turned in, hopefully before next class, so you can then shift to focusing on the final, which we will review for in detail next week. Okay, and extra credit, I'm extending it until the day the finals due, which is Saturday the 30th. I'll send you an email about that. But no one has maxed their extra credit out, so you have so many different options. If people still don't have that left, I've sent it twice. I'll probably send one more to everybody, an attachment with the rules for the class. At the bottom of that page, it says extra credit options, and they're numbered and listed in detail and described as to how many points you can get. And don't forget 2 in each category, except for articles. I'll accept up to 4 articles, because they're only worth 5 points each, since there's no real work involved. So that's 20 points, in other words, in each category. I'm trying to get people to do more than one thing for extra credit, so they vary their experiences with art. All right, any questions from anybody about anything we've covered tonight, about extra credit, your papers, grades? Anybody at all? All right, I think we...
I have a quick question.
Sure, go ahead.
The last slide on the syllabus, I don't know if you already said this, but the pyramids at the...
We're going to see that next week. Oh, we're not going to skip that. Well, we have 3 more slides. See, because I didn't cover, sure, it's fine to ask. Last week, I don't have them in the same file, and I've had so much else to do this last week that it'll have to be next week when we finish with 3 more new slides. That said, Paxton, it's on week 4, the previous page. the Crystal Palace, the Eiffel Tower. Now that one I'm not going to cut for the study list. And the one you're talking about, the pyramids of the Louvre, those will all be on the beginning of next week, right? And there'll be the final new slides. Yeah. And then we'll segue quickly from that into reviewing for the final. So we'll probably end quite early next week. I would say without needing a break, we probably could end about 8 o'clock or so. Okay. Anybody else have any other questions or anything?
Not a question,
Sure,
but
go
I
ahead.
just
Go ahead.
I wanted to thank you for looking over those
Oh,
images.
yeah. I'm sorry I didn't get to the other 6. I might be able to tomorrow if that's important to your friend. You're talking about your friend with the painting.
It's all right for her. It take as long as you need to on those.
Well,
I just
hope.
thought she could use a little bit of an outside eye to take a look.
Is this
at
a
the
person, your friend, an artist as a actual functioning? I mean, it doesn't mean that they're not.
She's an amateur. She calls herself an amateur at this point. She does it not for any professional reason. She does it because she likes to paint.
Well, if she should keep at it, I think she showed some skill. I put that in. Did you get the email where I responded to the first 6 out of the 12 you sent me?
I did. Yeah, I got it.
I
just
may
thought
have time to look at the other 6. I'll try to. I can't guarantee that, but the first 6 gives me enough of an idea. And there were 3 of them that stood out to me out of those 6. And I commented specifically on them, especially the one of the rabbit. That actually is very reminiscent of Albrecht Dürer. And if she doesn't know who he is, she should. Because if she looks at that painting, I said that in my email, she'll see what I mean. And that's a compliment more than a minor observation.
Yeah, I'll forward the email to her to have her look over.
Yeah, that's a good idea, even if I
just-
don't get to the other 6. Go ahead.
I wanted just one last thing. The pink lady, that one is unfinished.
Yeah, I thought so. Okay, now I understand because I wondered about that. All right, that helps to know. All right, I'll try to get to the others. I can't guarantee it, but I'd say it's 50-50. But she does have feedback already that I sent you. So please forward that to her. So she can,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And thanks again.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, that's part of, I think, what we're all here for. All right. Anybody else have any other questions? Luis or anyone else? Okay, we're just about ready to call it a night. All right, thank you, you guys. Oh, you raised your hand, so you do have a question.
Yeah, that's for after the recording.
Oh, okay, that's fine. I was going to say if that's what people are marking. So hang on, and I will do that right now. All right, good night, everybody, except I guess Luis here. So stop recording.